Chapter 6, Contradictory and Contrary Statements. Introduction. In the last chapter we dealt with the four kinds of categorical statements, A, I, E, and O statements. In this chapter we will deal with the first kind of relationship that these statements can have to one another. There are two relationships categorical statements can have to one another. The first is a relationship of opposition. The second is a relationship of equivalence. There are four different kinds of opposing relationships and three different kinds of equivalent relationships. In this chapter, we will discuss the first two of the four different relationships of opposition. When we use the term opposition, we mean the relationship which we observe in things we call opposite. If we say something is the opposite of another thing, we are saying the two things have a relationship of opposition. Statements that are in opposition affirm and deny the same predicate of the same subject. There are four ways that any two of these four statements, A, I, E, and O, can be related in opposition. In other words, any one of these statements can be said to be opposite to another in any one of four different ways. They can be contradictory to one another, they can be contrary to one another, they can be subcontrary, and they can be alternate. We will discuss only contradictory and contrary statements in this chapter and leave subcontrary and subalternate statements until the next chapter. The rule of contradiction. Let us begin the discussion of contradiction by articulating the rule of contradiction. Contradictory statements are statements that differ in both quality and quantity. What does this mean? If you remember, we set up a chart in Figure 5.1 to illustrate the four statements in terms of their quality and quantity. Using Figure 5.1 as a foundation, let us recreate this chart as Figure 6.1. As you can see, if you look at this chart, we've shown each of the four statements in a way that shows us both its quality and quantity. If we were to take our rule of contradiction and apply it, we would look at this chart and ask ourselves, which are the statements that differ in quality and quantity? Let us consider first the A statement. All S is P. What is the quality of the A statement? In other words, is it affirmative or negative? If you look at your chart, you will see that the quality of A is affirmative. It affirms something about S, namely that it is P. What is the quantity of the A statement? In other words, is it universal or particular? Does it affirm something about all A's or just some of them? In Figure 6.1, you can see that the quantity of A is universal. It says something about all S's, namely that they are all P's. Therefore, the quality of the A statement is affirmative. The quantity is universal. Which of the other three propositions, the I, E, or O statements, are contradictory to A? We know that whichever statement it is has to differ from A in quality and quantity. In other words, it has to be negative since A is affirmative, and particular since A is universal. Which of the other three propositions is negative and particular? If we look again at Figure 6.1, we see that it is the O proposition. Some S is not P. The O proposition is negative and particular. Since it differs from A in both quality and quantity, it is said to be contradictory to A. Now let us look at the E statement. No S is P. What is the quality of the E statement? In other words, is it affirmative or negative? We see that it is negative since it does not affirm, it denies. What is the quantity of the E statement? In other words, is it universal or particular? It is universal since it denies something of all S's, not just some of them. Therefore, the E statement is negative and universal. Which of the other statements, A, I, or O, is contradictory to E? In other words, which one of these differs from the E statement in both quality and quantity? Which statement is both affirmative since E is negative and particular since E is universal? If we look at Figure 6.1, we see that it is the I statement. The I statement is both affirmative and particular, making it differ from the E statement in both quality and quantity. We may conclude then that the E and I statements are contradictory to one another. We have determined then that A and O statements are contradictory and E and I statements are contradictory. We can see this graphically illustrated in Figure 6.2. Notice that while A and O statements and E and I statements are contradictory to one another, they are the only two contradictory pairs of statements. A and I statements are not contradictory to one another, nor are E and O statements, nor I and O statements, nor A and E statements. The first law of opposition. Let us now explore a little more what contradiction means. Let's start by first setting down the first law of opposition. Contradictories cannot at the same time be true nor at the same time be false. In order to further explain this rule, let us look at one pair of contradictories. Let's use the A and O statements. A, all S is P. O, some S is not P. Is there any way both can be true or both false at the same time? If it is true to say that all S is P, can it also be true to say that some S is not P? No. If all S is P, like statement A indicates, then there can be no S that is not P. But the O statement says that there is some S that is not P, so they can't both be true. Furthermore, if it is false to say that all S is P, can it also be false to say that some S is not P? No. If not all S is P, then some S must not be P, just like the O statement says. In other words, if the A statement is false, then the O statement must be true. They cannot both be false at the same time. Let's try it on some other statements. A, all men are mortal. Some men are not mortal. Can both of these statements be true? If all men are mortal, as in statement A, then there can be no men who are not mortal. But the O statement says that some men are not mortal, so they cannot both be true. And if it is false to say that all men are mortal, then there must be some men who are not mortal, which is just what statement O says, so they can't both be false. They can't both be true at the same time, and they can't both be false at the same time, just as the first law of opposition says. What about E and I statements? E, no men are gods. I, some men are gods. Can they both be true? If no men are gods, as in statement E, then we can't very well say that some men are gods, but the I statement says that some men are gods. Therefore, they cannot both be true. And if it is false to say that some men are gods, then there must not be any men who are gods, which is just what statement E says. No men are gods. So they cannot both be false at the same time. They cannot both be true at the same time. And they cannot both be false at the same time. Again, the first law of opposition has proved true. The A and E statements at first seem like they are contradictory. To say all S is P seems as if it should be contradictory to no S is P, but it is not. A and E statements are opposed to one another, but not by contradiction. The rule of contraries. The rule of contraries says the following. Two statements are contrary to one another if they are both universals, but differ in quality. Whereas there were two combinations of statements that we found to be contradictory, there is only one combination of statements that is contrary. We see immediately that the only two statements that are universal are A, all S is P, and E, no S is P. As you can see, although they are both universal, one is affirmative and one is negative. They are the same in quantity, but they differ in quality. They must therefore be contrary. You can see that the relationship between these two statements indicated on Figure 6.2. The second law of opposition. The second law of opposition applies to contraries. It says, contraries cannot at the same time both be true, but can at the same time both be false. If all S is P is true, then no S is P must be false. And if no S is P is true, then all S is P must be false. But if all S is P is false, We don't know whether no S is P is true or false because both could be false at the same time. If someone told us, for example, all men are white, and someone else told us no men are white, we know it would be impossible for both to be true. But they might both be false. They would both be false, for example, if some men were white and some black. We know that in the real world, this is in fact the case. Some men are white and some men are black. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned in this chapter. We learned first that according to the rule of contradiction, two statements are contradictory if they differ in both quality and quantity. Second, according to the first law of opposition, two contradictory statements cannot both be true at the same time, nor can they both be false at the same time. The rule of contradiction is a test you apply to determine whether two statements are contradictory. The first law of opposition tells us an essential characteristic of the relationship between contradictory statements. If you ever get confused about which statements are contradictory, all you have to do is remember that they must differ in both quality and quantity, and that they are diagonal to each other on the chart, figure 6.2. We learned also that according to the rule of contraries, two statements are contrary if they are both universal but differ in quality. Second, according to the second law of opposition, two contraries cannot both be true at the same time, but can at the same time both be false. Again, if you ever get confused about which statements are contrary, all you have to do is remember that they must both be universal but differ in quality, and that they are indicated on the chart, figure 6.2.